And we are live. That's my intro music. I've noticed other live streams. We are live. That's what I do every single time. Wow, super annoying. But here we are, streaming out to the Facebook group, the AutoCrit author community on Facebook, as well as the AutoCrit YouTube channel. Hi, everyone. Good to see people joining in. Once you join in, give us a comment. Let us know you're here, where you're joining from, what you're up to today, how excited you are about historical fiction, because very real. Let me check a couple of other things on my other screens. So many screens and so many.
When you end up with multiple screens with 50 tabs each.
Hi there from Mexico. That's awesome.
Oh,
hi, Angela.
Hey, everybody. Now, why am I not seeing those comments coming through? Definitely somebody's seeing them. There's Angela. Okay. I must be on a bit of a delay, but it's all okay because today's show. Oh, yes. I love reading this genre as well, Liz. It probably is I say this about a lot of things, but it probably is my favorite.
It's your favorite today.
My favorite. Today it is my favorite, hands down. But I just love, look at Steve. I love reading this genre so much so that I may go a little overboard. I'm actually doing a lot of audiobooks these days, and I've stumbled into one that apparently is not even historical fiction. It's just like straight up history. And I'm like, oh, I'm accidentally learning. No, goodness. Not what I intended. But it's also still really fun. Fantastic. So Steve's got a comment here. I'm just going to pull that onto the screen. Look. A professional historian who writes historical fiction flows out of his more academic work. Oh, excellent. You know, honestly, I have to say, we added historical fiction into the system and then life. So we've had it in there for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks even. And I hope it's still splashy and exciting because I know a lot of people have already seen it in the system and have been like, yes, I'm using historical fiction. And I'm like, oh man, we really meant to make a big splash with this, but goodness, it's all good. The goal is to provide it to our users and have them access it and use it and love it. And so if we don't make a huge splash, well, we're here today to make a huge splash. That's what we do. So, Utah, Canada, the UK. Oh my goodness, I'm feeling better about the weather here where I am in Georgia. Although it was 36 this morning, it's not Utah, and it's not frigid. I wouldn't describe it as frigid, so I feel better. Wilmington, oh, gorgeous. Oh, I used to live in North Carolina. I miss it so much. Welcome. And Jacksonville and Oklahoma, cold and snowy. Boy, I am feeling better. I'm wearing short sleeves today. So, well, welcome everybody. Today, I have with me Daniel and Gareth from the AutoCrit team.
Hello.
And we are going to talk about historical fiction. So Gareth, as always, has taken a look under the hood of several books, and we've added several great authors to the system. So I'm, without further ado, going to hand it over to Gareth to talk with us about some of the really interesting things he's found using AutoCrit with historical fiction. And the screen's up. All right, I'm just going to make your screen cover the whole flow there and let you kick it off. I know you have some really fun stuff for us, Gareth.
Boom. So today in my nightly costume, we'll just have a look at a few different books that we loaded in to run under the historical fiction setting and see if there's anything interesting we can find here. It won't be a deep dive into all of them because it would just take forever, but to give you an overview of what's in store, what you might be comparing to, and some of the authors that we brought in to go along with this genre. I'm sure, as some of you have noticed, if you have been poking around in historical fiction, it's not just the genre that's been added in there. There's also a nice little selection of individual authors you can compare your writing with. And one of the things I loaded in is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Now, you will have to forgive me because I'm not a historical fiction reader. So the ins and outs of the stories here that we'll look at, I really don't know. But checking out the summary reports on some of these, if we, for example, have Wolf Hall, I did see the book cover, and it seems to have been adapted to TV and all sorts of stuff. So I'm sure it's very, very popular. We're actually coming in at an overall score of 85.18, which is pretty high for most books that we see. It's quite a pleasing result, and I'll show you some escalation as we go with different authors as well. But starting off with 85.18 is really strong for this book. Even though, as we go down, you'll notice some quite high numbers in our fingerprint, so quite a lot for repetition. Pacing doesn't have a whole lot of issues, neither does dialogue in comparison, but 13,000 for word choice and strong writing kind of across the board there. So if we get down to the dials, we'll find out. But you're likely to have a higher number of indicators the longer the book is. We got over 200,000 words here.
Oh, wow.
So, your numbers are naturally going to be higher in that regard than other books. We'll cross-reference that against a different book in a moment, but just keep that in mind for your own things. Although you'll notice that even though it's a super long book, it's historical fiction, which you might think in your mind will naturally mean more complicated language and things like that. The Dale Child grade level is still 4. So it's quite a low accessibility level. People can still read it quite easily. In terms of our sentences, 10 average words per sentence is similar to what we see. We normally see it fall around 9. 9-10 works. The paragraphs again, 9.33% of slow-paced paragraphs is something that stood out. I know, Beth, you like to keep it as far, is that 10 as your upper benchmark?
It really is. This is, and I think we talked about this a little earlier because it is so... it so tends to have a more exposition, right? But that's interesting. It's much higher than what we see in other best-selling novels, which is around the 2% mark. So
a little sneak preview of what's coming up. It'll only go higher. So this was probably the lowest of 3 books that I put in here, and it's quite understandable for historical fiction. They tend to be, I think, a little slower in the storytelling, if I'm getting it right, from kind of excerpts and things I've seen, because they have their own kind of drift and pace to them. I guess these stories of sort of courtly intrigue and things like that, they have a very definite feel, which lends itself to a more almost poetic type of prose, which will definitely lean into slower pacing at times. However, for Hillary here, when we get into our general dials, adverbs, we're almost just maxed out at the top there. So even though there's 1,089 adverbs detected in the manuscript, we're pretty much great. And generic descriptions is also one that can be super tough to even get around the average or above, just by the general basic use of language. That's a really, really good result, and it's probably why the overall score is so high. Sitting around the 85, because really nothing in these core dials has us up in the red, which is a great thing to see.
This definitely makes me want to pick this book up.
Yeah, just give it a sort of inspection to see how she's doing.
Yes.
Power words, always a cool one. These seem quite similar. We'll look at a couple of the other books coming up here, but a hefty dose of encouragement is always in there for drama. We have fear, which of course combined is a very dramatic story, and then we tend to find a combination of sort of greed, the forbidden, and lust. I think across the board as we move on here, you'll see that in the other books as well, which again talks to the a lot of these historical fiction things are based in intrigue and usually murder and whodunits and that kind of thing. All this courtly backstabbing.
Oh, I love courtly intrigue.
Couldn't really skirt over these dials as well because we have the dialogue tags. Might seem a little shocking with 1,520 others. Now, looking into the actual manuscript, there are alternative dialogue tags. So, for example, roaring or roared. This is because the book is actually in present tense. So we've got bellows, which would be bellowed if you were writing past tense. And at the moment, the platform will pick up asks and says as alternative tags rather than versions of said and asked. And that really came to the forefront for us when we were running these historical fiction novels through, because more of them than I expected are actually present tense. in the writing. So that's something the platform is being updated to accommodate it for very, very soon. So don't worry about that if you like present tense in your own stuff.
I love that Gareth he's taking a note from my playbook and doing a spoiler. So yeah, we're working to include now says and asks to the dialogue tags. So if you're writing in present tense, which is becoming wildly popular these days, soon, very soon, you will be able to get better information out of AutoCrit for that. I'm excited for that, actually.
Yeah, it'll cut down on if you do present tense a lot, it'll cut down on having to do your exclusions and things like that to get a better picture. So it's going to be good stuff. Word frequency on this book is right up front. King, we're talking historical stuff here. King, Lord, Lady, King's
Cromwell,
Cromwell, different characters going in there.
I'm definitely picking up
the phrase frequency.
Putting it on my Amazon wish list right now.
This is definitely a story featuring the king and the cardinal, and if that sounds intriguing, then it's going to be one for you.
Oh yes, Liz, what do you think about that? I feel like this is my next book. Although I'm quite backlogged, so yeah. Ooh, fun.
Beth's reading list is never going to end at this point.
It never will. Neither will my movie watching list, because I'm sitting in on our classes, and there are so many great ways to study writing scenes by watching movies and taking notes and stuff. But so now my Netflix queue will never be empty, nor will my bookshelf. And I love it that way. That's fantastic. Well,
more stories to enjoy.
Here we go.
In this next one, I've loaded in Jean Granger's Trials and Tribulations. In historical fiction sense, we're coming in at 78.39 on this one. There's quite a big difference. You might notice in the fingerprint, obviously the numbers are a lot lower. So it's like, why is the score lower if the numbers are a lot lower? Simply because it's about half the length, just over 100,000 words. So the proportion is probably a little higher. We'll get to the dials in a second. But again, we're around the same kind of reading grade level of 4. 12 average words per sentence is starting to push it up. And with that longer average words per sentence, we're starting to slow down in pace. Oh. So now we have a 13% slow pace paragraphs. I think that's the highest one of the 3.
I mean, that's quite high, but look at how great they're doing on things like adverb use and showing versus telling.
It seems adverbs across the board seem to be superb for these authors in this genre. They really keep an eye on that. Again, generic descriptions. Just above average, but that can always be a tough one to figure out. Although this particular novel suffers a lot when it comes to the filler words.
Wow.
I think I ran the filler words report. This is the pacing report. One thing to point out there with the 13%. Wow. If we look at our little sort of scale here, we've still got a nice variation going on in terms of paragraph lengths. However, with certainly a lot more clusters of red chunks down here with the pacing of the paragraphs as we go. Usually what I would do is look out for chunky bits where there's a nice collection together, and that might be a spot that you want to take a look at. Sometimes you'll see that in your own report, but it's quite easy to just kind of visually place it and understand that that's more or less going to be a act break. So you're transitioning from Act 1 to Act 2 or Act 2 to Act 3. You might slow down a little for the transition. But in the case of this book, there seems to be a good number of clusters, so I can't really pinpoint where that's going to be. So that's something I would look at for this particular novel. And if we go in, we can see the highlighted points. And there it is. There's a nice big chunk here.
Oh,
it definitely seems to slow down.
I love how visually compelling AutoCrit is when it shows these things to me, because that stands out. And I really want to break those paragraphs down and keep that action moving forward. Yeah,
I wouldn't always kind of lose it personally just seeing something like this, but when you get a nice big cluster like we had before, you want to just have a quick look and see if there's a way to move it forward a bit quicker. And then the filler words that were pretty high on the gauge, we're up here in the excess. So it's really you'll notice that it doesn't seem to be overused. So even with 970 uses in the novel, that's still kind of accessible or acceptable in the realm of historical fiction, which may be different for other genres. However, just at 314, it seems a lot less tolerant of that as a genre. So we won't go by and check them all out, but a lot of it is in dialogue. in this book as you tend to find. And some of the other uses I find are part of the kind of narrative voice. In this book, the author seems to be talking quite well throughout different parts of the narration, which is from the perspective of a certain character, and they will use just to say it was just this, or it was just that, and just over there. So most of the things that I've seen are kind of fine. And this is in dialogue as well. So Bo's not just a member of staff. People use that dialogue, and it has a purpose to give more importance to the person, and not let their stature be taken away. Similar in power words as we had before. Encouragement, fear. We're dialed down a little bit on the forbidden over in this one, instead switching over to lust. So I'm assuming there's possibly some kind of love story here, or triangle, or something like that. And a bit of greed, which is always, greed, I guess, tends to show up quite a lot in the historical fiction level. Because that can be, it's not just longing for riches or whatever, but also political power and things like that. In this case, we have a pretty standard split between said and us and others. I believe this one is third-person narrative, and past tense. And what you'll also find a lot of the time with the word frequency, it's character names.
Mm-hmm.
Really the most common thing to show up, especially if there's a lot of dialogue, which I guess in historical fiction as well, with these sort of sweeping stories, there is going to be a lot of dialogue and character interaction. Although the phrase frequency in this one is a lot more spread out. It's not just the king and the cardinal.
Ooh, wow, look at that.
Although a lot of it does involve Kate, I guess, Kate and Kate was. So definitely character bound, but it seems the net's a lot wider in this story in terms of what characters are getting up to and which characters are doing it.
Right. I like that variation of this is one of the more varied phrase frequency word clouds that I've seen.
Yeah.
Cool.
And moving on, what was the third one?
Ooh,
yes. Put it in Philippa Gregory, the White Queen.
Just love her work.
And I believe Philippa Gregory is known as the Queen of Historical Fiction. Is she? I think that's the moniker. I wanted to, with one of the books, just try the comparisons on different levels. So you notice this one's actually comparing to general fiction for the score, 78.3. And then if we switch that to historical fiction, we climb a little tiny bit, 78.45. That kind of shift of sort of slightly upwards when you're comparing to genre is usually a good sign that the book is structurally sound by itself. If you've got a pretty good score against general fiction, and then take a slight jump up when you go in your genre, you're on a good path. And this time we also compared to Philippa's personal profile as well, with 81.52, which again brings it even closer to the desired style, which I guess would be the author herself. Because that series, it is part of a series. I think there's the White Queen, the Red Queen.
Red Queen, yeah.
Maybe one or two others, or perhaps more. I don't know the entire series, but I saw the titles. And I think if you compared the other books, you'd probably see them in a similar, sitting around a similar number. I wouldn't expect them to hit the 90s or anything like that.
No, that makes total sense.
But if we have a look at the fingerprint on this one, numbers are quite pleasantly low there in pacing and dialogue. And what kind of length are we looking at here? About 140,000. So we're sitting up strong writing, repetition, and strong writing is probably where we want to look. Again, our Dale Chalgrade level is a 4. Seems to be shared across them all. 13 average words per sentence, and it did get higher, 15.65%.
Wow. What? And get Philippa on the phone. And look at those average words per paragraph. That's higher as well. If you think about the pacing and the overall flow, you can see the sentences getting longer, the paragraphs getting longer. I'm excited to see some of the word clouds in the bottom when we talk about. Yeah,
for sure. You normally see in your paragraph by word count, this will usually step down until the 100 plus is a lot lower. But in this case, we get a kind of a bump up at the bottom there on the getting to the very long end of the scale. So that's probably what's affected the average. and more or less probably what's the culprit in causing the slower sections as well. However, whoever's out there that's actually read the book, did it feel that way? Let us know.
I've read it and it didn't feel that way, but because I feel for me when I read it, it was so immersive, just built in world building and very three-dimensional characters. It doesn't seem slow paced because there's so much richness in there. Yeah,
exactly. That's probably exactly right. I was going to say, when that kind of thing can happen, it is because the author's trying to add so much richness to the setting, to what's going on. If you're thinking of another type of novel where a character is just walking down a street, that might take a half a paragraph to get them down that street. Comes to historical, you really want to set the scene there and try to bring the reader into it with, let's say cobblestones and walls, everything that's all the bustle of a market and things like that. So getting the detail in there really brings it. It just means you have to do more work.
No, well, I guess I'm not going to write historical fiction.
Susan in the chat has an interesting question. She says her score is 91. She noticed many famous authors are in the high 70s. Should she be concerned?
It's an excellent question. Gareth, do you want to take first crack at that?
I would say that it's kind of contextual. I don't think I'd be too concerned. It depends what you're comparing to as well.
Yeah.
If you're comparing to general fiction, probably not too concerned, but getting around into the low to mid 90s is time to sort of slow down. Go back, reread the work, and just make sure you're not stripping too much soul out of it. And your voice is still there. The closer you get to 100, the more you're risking everything becoming too perfunctory in your writing. So rather than having enough description in life, it's actually starting to go in, maybe going in the opposite direction, where you're being too, they walked over here, they looked at this, they picked this up, they did that, and not really taking us into the characters' heads anymore. That's the only risk when you start getting up there. So I would say at that point, no, just kind of stop where you are, step back and take stock and read it back to yourself and make sure you're still there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would take a look also at some of the key dials that Gareth is showing right now. So the big heavy hitters are the showing versus telling, adverbs. Filler words are very easy to resolve, but looking a little bit deeper rather than just looking at that overall summary score, just making sure that you're pleased with, for example, the amount of showing versus telling and some of those kind of big barriers to getting out of the slush pile. That'd be my advice. But don't be worried about a 91. It's high, but it's very good. It may also have a bit of a play with the number of words that you're running through, because sometimes the scores can vary on smaller works, as we've seen with the 100,000, 300,000 that Gareth's running through. It swings less in the larger works. So maybe that is a factor as well.
Yeah, smaller things, I guess the fewer words you're using, the more likely you are to get closer to whatever the comparison is going to be.
Yeah.
Just by virtue of the sort of toolbox of words that every profile and yourself are working with. So the longer you get, the more you might diverge from that.
I just want to pull up Liz's comment really quickly, because you heard me giggling in some inappropriate area earlier, and this is why, because I saw this come through.
It does feel like that at times.
Yeah, it'd be like that sometimes. It feels like it's taking so long. By the time the agents get through with it, it's going to be like it was a contemporary novel, and now it is deeply historical fiction. Thanks for the laugh, Liz. That was great.
Although I'd be worried, I guess it depends how much worse things get. What if it was written in 2020 and whoever's reading it later on as historical fiction is like, oh, those were good times.
Oh, cool. I love your dark soul. So fantastic.
So in this regard, going back to the score thing as well, is as you said, things like filler words are super easy to remove, but I think also keep in mind things like the context of what we pointed out there, the way they were used in Wolf Hall. A word like just is a great example of it, because 99.9% of the time it is filler, but where it can be acceptable is something like that conversation that was in that book where it says he's not just a servant.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's saying that to somebody. So just because just is highlighted, how many times I'm going to say just here, but just because just is highlighted doesn't mean you have to remove it. If it's contextual, leave it in there, because there's a definite difference between just saying that somebody's not a servant and saying, look, he's not just a servant, okay? You know, there's real context in that dialogue where the word is perfectly right.
I'm going to see a few more people joining in from Italy and Vermont. And quick, and Angela, who is living on the Ethan Allen homestead, which sounds fun. The dialogue in historical fiction, and Daniel may be talking about this a little bit later, the dialogue and vernacular of the Civil War, the North and the South. So some of that vocabulary is considered kind of no-nos. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Are you meaning like something is socially not acceptable, or are they kind of, and Kevin has a similar question. Yeah. So we'd just love if you want to type into the chat there a little more information about the context you're looking for, if they are socially unacceptable, you know, words that you're not supposed to say anymore. I'd say leave them in because it's true to the period, but it sounds like a great way, as Bruce mentions, to kind of use your personal words list and the exceptions list to just make sure that you're tracking them, that you're not overusing them, and that you're using them in the context that you intend, etc. Daniel, thoughts on that?
That sounds fair. I think the overall kind of tip or decision on that one, I would defer to Daniel.
Who's coming up soon? Let's he's standing in the wings just off the stage.
Yeah, I'm going to bring him. We'll bring him in just a minute on horseback. To a few tips for writing in the actual genre as well. Because if you haven't seen it already, we have a short little video on the YouTube channel with a few tips from Daniel, which is quite handy. But he's going to jump in here in a minute and answer more. Just to round out this White Queen novel, we have our power words here. Said they're very similar across the three, and I think it's probably just a similarity in story content from the three books I picked, which again is going to be things like intrigue and all the courtly stuff with a bit of love affairs and backstabbing, certainly greed. These are all standing out quite a lot, and encouragement is always there because encouragement drives. Encouraging words bring readers through with a sense of hope in any kind of story. I don't think many would read to the end of something that is just, even if it were a horror story, you're not going to really make it to the end if everything is just consistently miserable and off-putting.
It's awful all the time.
Yeah.
It's like that's there at Sappy Place. Come on.
And I find much the same thing in this novel. As you may look here, it's because it's, as we can see here in our tense, it's present tense. And that'll be all up to date very, very soon.
I imagine there's probably two reasons why you're saying that. I would imagine it's a combination of present tense has become much more trendy because young adult fiction used it, and now those readers are growing up, and so they're just more used to the format. But I also imagine people who write a historical fiction, the big thing they're trying to overcome is, this is actually happening now. It's not something that happened in the past, so they might want to compensate for that by putting it in present tense. So it's like, you've gone in your time machine and you're back in that time, and it's just a way to reinforce that, perhaps. Reinforce
the immersion that you're going for. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah,
and I
think that's very true.
Angle. I like that perspective, Daniel.
With our word frequency here, a lot of stuff again, just titles, names, locations are going to be the most common things, and of course it's courtly intrigue, King Henry probably.
Do love it, yes.
And then our phrase frequency in this one is a bit more spread out as well, even though it is the king again. The king.
Good to be the king.
You're front and center when you are. And I think that's that for the three books to really just poke at today. To drive it back to the additions here in the system, it's not just these 3 authors that we have in there. If I go to fiction authors, there were a number. You'll have to call it out if I scroll past one. We already had Diana Gabaldon in there from Outlander.
She's awesome.
And she's already there, so that's good. We got Gore Vidal.
Ooh, Hillary Mantel.
There's Hillary Mantel. And Jean Granger. Philippa Gregory.
I know Kevin knows this list right off the top of his head.
Probably. Sharon McCrum.
Oh, good one. And I've seen a couple of requests to add some other historical fiction authors to our comparison platform. Bernard Cornwell was requested. What's the one from yesterday? A very prolific female historical fiction writer from the 1960s was also requested. So we've got a few other ideas and suggestions that we're looking into to get even more historical fiction authors in there for us. So great. Ooh.
Yep, there are always more to add.
Yeah, definitely. The more prolific, the better benchmarking we can do. So
Indeed.
Yeah.
So I will hand it over at this point to Daniel. He's going to give us a few tips for just actually writing or getting involved in the historical fiction genre. Again, I think if you have any questions as we go, just pop them in the chat.
Yeah, great. You're up, Daniel.
All right, so we'll take a look at our little historical fictions tip book here. So the fun thing about historical fiction is that people describe it as having a realistic enough voice, because a lot of times you're not trying to capture a completely authentic voice. For one, that's daunting. I mean, especially depending on the era you're representing. If you're going back just a little bit in time, maybe you're going back to, I don't know, the 1950s and the 1920s or the 1880s. It's quite different than if you're going back to like Middle English or things like that, where you need a translator. So obviously you're not going to emulate that exactly. But it does help you to study the original language, study works that are written from the period themselves, things that you can find. Obviously, this gets more challenging depending on what era you're doing. If you're doing an era where the works are in English, even in earlier English, it's a lot different than if you're doing something and you're going back to like ancient Egypt or ancient Greece, because then not only do you have the difference in time, but you have a language difference, right? So it's a lot more imagination is allowed in those situations. The audience is going to accept that it's not going to be the authentic writing of the time. They are just looking for something that doesn't feel too anachronistic or contemporary. So it's you have a sense of what it is because you've consumed different entertainments and read books and seen movies. There's this style that people come up with that it doesn't feel quite modern, but yet it doesn't feel so out of touch that they can't relate to it. So it is that realistic enough sort of feel to it. So
Ken has a good example. I just popped Angela's up there. When researching and writing her Civil War piece, definitely they've used vocabulary that no longer exists. So when you're trying to convey that, Ken has a great suggestion. It's mid 1800s US vocab is just way off the charts, but you can convey that meaning through the context, through the character interactions, etc., and describe it with examples. So I think those are great tips as well coming in from the community.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's something that obviously, you have readers that are going to be able to pick up on context clues and things like that. And so they'll understand, they're using that word maybe in a different way than we use now, or I don't know that slang term, but I can tell what they're talking about, things like that. But where AutoCrit is going to come into play, which is what Gareth was talking about, is to really compare you to other authors means you might not go off the rails in terms of trying to duplicate the voice too much, because if you try to emulate the style of a 1700s or 1800s novel, that may be great depending on what you're trying to do. But if you're really trying to emulate, Philippa Gregory or something like that, that's not necessarily going to be the same. I mean, look at present tense, right? Books in that era were not generally written in present tense. So that's something that was picked up. And a lot of other things in terms of pacing and word usage and whatnot. Now, I did see some people talking about making their own, word lists, and that could be helpful because you can train the tool itself. But the nice thing about the tool, picking up on those unusual words is that it does flag for you what isn't a normal word for the reader, because you don't want to overuse it. You don't want it to be so daunting that the person's having to translate your book. You want to have that sprinkling of information. And really, I would say a lot of times where this comes out is in dialogue, where people talk. The prose itself, it's not as demanding on the reader, but when people talk, that's what can really pull you out. I mean, you have the obvious example where if somebody's like, "Hey, dude," that, is going to pull you out. But even something less obvious than that, like, you're a teenager. It's really a modern concept. It's not something that people thought of as a concept until really like the last century. Prior to that, it was children and adults. There was not really this middle ground. And so that's something to look out for when people talk, is what is going to be modern language with contemporary language versus language from the past. But again, when you go back to the past, you're not necessarily going to emulate it completely, because then you'll end up in, Old King James language or something like that, or even more obscure, and people won't necessarily want to wade through that sort of language. The important thing is to be consistent, right?
Good one.
And you want to sprinkle this through. This is the salt. Now, salt is helpful, right? It gives everything its flavor. Overdoing it, though, and it just overpowers everything. So you kind of think of these sort of details, all this research, as that. But consistency is key. After all, you wouldn't want a character in one area calling a policeman a copper, and then they switch it to cop because different eras, different reasons why they would say one or the other, or, are they using these and thous in one area and then they switch to something else? There's somebody saying, I think there's more danger in applying contemporary thinking and attitude than language. Yes, that is true. That is true. People are often even willing to excuse the mechanical process of the word choice, and it's really more if they don't seem like they behave in the way that they would act in that era. So do you have a situation where there really should be a true hierarchy and people are being very casual with talking with people with different ranks, and that's not something that they would have done in that era? They would have been more cognizant of that. Or different groups, talking to different groups in terms of their hierarchies and things like that. Yeah, you can definitely pull people out of a story in a hurry. And that's what it's about. It's about the audience, right? Because this is fiction. This is generally for entertainment. There certainly could be educational value in that. You might do a lot of great research and you might be, adding to the conversation. But a lot of the times what you're about is telling a great story, right? And this is just another way of playing in the sandbox. It's just you're using the historical period as your sandbox. And audiences is where it can get tricky as well, because sometimes you don't want to be accurate because the audience will not accept it because it's not what they commonly believe. All of this great research you'll do, and then you'll end up with the audience not accepting the actual fact because they think of something that they believe to be true is actually true when it's not. So it's finding that balance. Again, it's that balance of too much realism or not enough realism. So for example, Napoleon, people like to harp on Napoleon that he was awfully short. Well, from what I understand, he really wasn't all that short. He was pretty much average height. But again, it's just something, it's a trope, things like that. Viking helmets didn't actually have horns. They've just...
Wait, what? No. I don't accept that. I see what you mean now. That absolutely not.
It depends on the audience. A lot of people who read historical fiction are savvy enough to realize that some of their preconceived notions might be challenged. They're coming to that. But it depends. It depends on what type of style you're emulating, who your audience is, and so on. You've got to be careful. The movie example is like in movies, they always pull out the sword. It's like shing, and of course that would ruin the sword, right? You're never going to actually have that when you're pulling out a sword. That shing, that's terrible. But because people are so used to that sound, if you ever film a movie and you have it be normal, which is there's no sound, they're like, well, that's a prop sword. That's not even real. Even though it makes no sense. It makes no logical sense. So there is the literary equivalent. There are things to worry about. In my video, I talk about what they sometimes call the Tiffany effect, because like the name Tiffany goes back. It actually would have been historically correct in Victorian era, but you think of it as like an 80s name. So you put in somebody with that name and you're like, yeah, the author doesn't know what they're talking about. Even though they do.
With an eye. Yeah.
Another fact I've heard about is that apparently in London, even as early as like the 1800s, you could receive and get messages within the same day. There was that much delivery. So it's not the same as like text messaging, but you could literally like send a letter in the morning, get to somebody in the afternoon, maybe get another one in the evening. There were like so many deliveries at post. And again, that's something that maybe people would find unbelievable, so you'd have to be careful how you would include it in your story. And remember, too, when you're doing research, a lot of things are copied from one to another. It doesn't mean it's necessarily true either. You have to be careful. There are lots of ideas that float around there, and I'm sure you've all seen that. We have some savvy historians out there that they have some urban legends I'm sure they would love to quell, because it's just so prevalent, and yet it's completely wrong. It happens all the time. Ultimately, be careful, though. You don't want world building disease. You don't want, just like somebody who's writing fiction will spend all of the time developing, the city it takes place or the world. This is the same thing. I mean, people say the past is a foreign country, right? You're going back into history and you are trying to, develop the world. You want it to be believable. You want to do that research, but be careful that you don't spend so much time, or you have this pile of stuff that you want to include in your work, and then you end up just trying to filter it in every which way. Somebody said here,
Susan and Young.
Yeah, if you pull information from a certain book on King Tut, it's must to reference your source and your references for legal reasons. That's an interesting point. I did not know that, but that does make sense.
Yeah. No, the question is it a must?
Oh, is it a must?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then a secondary part to that question. So if you've just used the concepts in a fictional way, then maybe you don't have to reference it. This is a really great question, two-part question. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this? In terms of having to reference, I mean, I feel like we're writing fiction, and it's not necessarily an academic requirement to, of course, don't plagiarize. Well, that's that. But referencing the source, you could reference them in the back, but I don't know that in a fiction book it's required to do like the footnotes and the hardcore, referencing.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a legal requirement, but you could do it if you like to, as long as you're not, if you're directly quoting the material, then you might want to reference it. But if you're just kind of using it, if it's a certain book that you use during the research phase, there's no obligation to actually reference it legally.
Yeah, and
right. Because I think it comes into the what can be common knowledge. Like if you can observe something and you can discover it, then it's not really copyrightable. It's the same thing with scientific concepts. Like you can patent a chemical process and things like that, but just the knowledge of its existence is not something you can patent. So you may not be able to make your own whatever Xerox machine or whatever in the same way, but you can acknowledge the fact that they exist in a piece of fiction. That's not the same thing, unless you literally were potentially telling them how to do it, and you had the secret formula of Coke or something, and that's part of your book. But, for something like historical research, I would say if you do include somebody's historical theories, maybe reach out to them, because, hey, I would imagine that they would be excited to hear from an author who's using their theory in a work, because it's fun. But I don't think you don't have any legal obligation to.
Yeah, I liked Angela's suggestion that you could put something in historical notes section in the back. I've seen this become more prevalent if you're going, I'm going to call it like hard historical fiction. If you are really digging into the historical part of it and it's only sprinkled with fictional situations, that's a little bit different than going full bore kind of entertainment fiction that is set in history, in my experience. And then having the historical notes section at the back can be really helpful if you're going for more hardcore history rather than focusing on the fictional part. So good suggestion.
All right, good question. Made me think. I like that. But remember, people do not show up to, Comic-Con or on Halloween dressed up like a book cover. They dress up like characters. So that's where you have to get past your world building disease. Really go make sure that it serves the purpose of the story. It serves the purpose of the characters. It serves the purpose of the narrative that you are talking about. Don't feel any obligation to include all of that wonderful research in your book. This is kind of the iceberg concept, right? You want that research because the audience can tell. They can tell that, what they're seeing is just that top of the iceberg, but underneath you have that knowledge. That is something that they'll be able to notice, fear not. And if it makes sense organically, it'll find its way in the story. Just don't include every piece of information. They often say kill your darlings in fiction. A darling that can show up in historical fiction is that really awesome thing that you found out about the past that nobody knew about, and you're just going to figure out a way to include it in that story. It's like, did you really know they had, whatever, metal zippers way earlier than they thought, or, they were eating tomatoes way earlier, and I'm just going to figure out a way to put that in. And sometimes it's just not necessary. So be cautious of that. Be cautious of that. Yes, kill the darling. Not every detail needs to make it in. And ultimately, this can really, you can really rub against this when dealing with historical fiction that takes place that involves an event that people know about. Because obviously you can really go down the rabbit hole if it's a historical event, because there's been a lot of detail about it. But what can also happen is maybe the book isn't about that historical event. It just takes place at the same time as that historical event. And then you'll end up where I've seen this happen, where you kind of do not a subplot, but like a side plot, where all of a sudden the book goes off and does this really beautiful recreation of this event, and then you go back to the story, and it's not necessary. If the characters were not a key player in the historical event, you don't have to go into all that detail that you're discovering about it. Put them in the scene, make them a participant in the event. You don't have to recount every little nuanced detail. And it's important to know, too, like, what are you doing? Are you doing a historical fiction where it just takes place at the same time? Or are you fictionalizing an event that people know about? Because two different things.
Interesting, yeah.
One thing to keep in mind, too, is don't be afraid to use resources that you might not expect. For example, Google Maps may not be that applicable for historical fiction, but it can tell you, how long it would be to walk from Paris or Berlin, for example. So, and that's not going to be an exact, because it's based on, modern paths and things like that. But it will give you a ballpark idea. So you can have an idea of, oh, well, if my character needed to do this, how long would it have taken them? And, you can map that out and things like that. You can obviously find, maps, photographs, ways to visualize the past online. Don't be afraid to look that up, look around. I mean, the internet is great for those sort of things.
Right. And having those pictures and facts at hand can really help set your mood as you're writing, really. To have a great historical photo of an important building that's part of your story that's something I would definitely put on my mood board and keep that front and center as I'm writing. Just help keep me in the vibe. Love
Right,
it.
and especially things with like clothing and whatnot, having that visual is
Yeah.
just so helpful, because you can read a description of what a dress would have been like in a different era, but really getting to visualize it, because often what you'll read is very academic. It's more mechanical. It's just they would have had this many buttons and this kind of material and whatever, and that's not the same thing as a way an artist would approach it in terms of painting the visual picture and the sensory detail that you might pick up on when you can actually see it firsthand when you can. So that's helpful to have. And the good thing about AutoCrit is that it can help you with that mechanical feel to your piece in terms of the pacing, the average, and stuff like that. So if you were to hand it off to an editor, they can look for that historical errors, and it's more easy to send it to alpha readers and beta readers and have them look for the historical details and really pick it out versus, worrying about how many adverbs you used or whether or not you changed your tenses or the different things that AutoCrit can pick up on. It really helps you as an author, get that out of the way, get a lot of the mechanical noise out of the way, because with historical fiction, it is often very helpful to have other readers, hone in on your piece that know their stuff. And so you can make sure you don't make any errors on that. So that's a little bit about historical fiction.
Well, and you mentioned something really interesting that we had a conversation about in another live stream recently. Alpha readers versus beta readers, sensitivity readers come into this. As you're writing historical fiction, the general rule of thumb for things like sensitivity readers, or I want to call them fact checkers-ish, but making sure that you really get the feel and the accuracy of that period, despite all the research you've done. If there are academics who specialize in this area, if they would agree to be an alpha reader for you, just to ensure that you have consistency and you have accuracy in the historical aspects of your story, the farther away you are from your topic, the earlier you should bring those alpha readers in to help you with things like that. And that applies to kind of sensitivity readers as well. If you're writing in a different gender, for example, so just having someone who has more experience as an alpha reader can be tremendously helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, like I said, very beneficial to have that second pair of eyes. And it gets back to what I was saying about that Tiffany effect too. You can end up where they may flag something as historically inaccurate that isn't, but then you'll realize, oh, well, I need to hang a lantern on it a little bit more, that this is actually legit. This actually was the way it was, because people are going to look at it as an anachronism when actually it's reality.
Yeah. Those reader expectations, like they don't expect a Queen Tiffany, but it could have happened. Fantastic. Sorry, go ahead. Gareth, was that you? I think we're all caught up on questions coming in from the chat and in the community. So, yeah.
I like that. Tell the story, not the history. That is a very pithy way of putting it. I like that. Very true. Yeah. And that's why you do that research, and then you keep the iceberg approach, right? You can keep it under the surface, and that's fine. But at least the research can be helpful to help you avoid a mistake, even if it's not anything you would ever include in the story. You would just realize, well, I can't have this in the story because they didn't have that invention back in the era that I'm writing. So that's not a solution for the character. I'm going to have to come up with something else.
That is wonderful. We're getting a little bit of love for Garrett's icon outfit there. It's kind of historical fantasy.
My suit of armor is at the dry cleaner right now. I'm sorry, but maybe next time.
Well, what a wonderful session today, guys. I really appreciate everybody joining us and learning a little bit more about the new historical fiction genre. And sorry, kitten is just going wild today. Okay, so and the new comparison authors, the benchmarking authors that we have available now, as well as some tips on writing your own historical fiction novel. Thank you, Daniel. And the community has been wonderful in giving their tips as well. Keep that up in the AutoCrit author community on Facebook. And I think with that, dive into AutoCrit and take a look around and compare your work with Philippa Gregory. I have to go get reading. Thanks, everybody. Do we have one more question? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they started to get retired Navy and book about Navy, too technical. Yeah, it is a risk when you're super passionate or you have that life experience to include too much. But it really is a fine balance. Like, I've read works by people and they've done that research and they really can put me in a world, and it's a world that I'm not familiar with, and it's wonderful. So that's where, having that extra set of eyes can help. And what I might recommend in a situation like that, if you're worried about it, is, maybe write a little bit, like a chapter or something, and then kind of send it off and just say, is this hooking you, or am I including too much? Just to kind of get the idea of what the tone of the piece, how much level of detail you're going to go in. So that way, as you progress, you can either, pull back if you need to, or you can say, oh, you know what, the audience actually is going to go for this. I can get away with this, and keep going. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think further on the area of tell the story first and then support it with facts, the creative memoirs is certainly that. Falls into that realm for me. The story is the most important thing. If you're talking memoirs and creative memoirs and perhaps fictionalized memoirs of characters who may or may not have existed, telling that story first, because that's really the heart and soul of why you're writing, is why you're telling the story, is the story itself. And then support it with appropriate facts that are well researched and that are relevant to the story, and add that credibility. Thoughts on that, Gareth, Daniel?
I agree.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, the creativity of the memoir, I say, like, the only risk is, if your creativity goes too much, then it'll cease to be in a memoir is even more plausible, right? Because it really is trying to hone in on its almost reality. So just be very careful with your creativity about the plausibility about what you're doing. People do expect hyperbole, exaggeration, changes of events in terms of order, maybe combining characters, people in the life into one person just for the ease of the story. But if it starts to go too much further, then you're really getting into more like fiction, and too much further, and you're getting into historical fantasy. So, and which is fine. That's great. But then it's like, oh, I've heard there are historical fantasies, with historical characters in them. I mean, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, right? So, you can go any which way you want. So just realize what you're doing and what your audience is and what their expectation is.
Fantastic. And with that, we will draw to a close this episode of whatever it is we're doing here, live stream, announcing historical fiction as a new genre to compare. I'm going to grab the link to the video that Daniel referenced. It's out on our YouTube channel. I'll grab that link and post it in the AutoCrit author community as well. It's just a little bit longer tips and tricks from Daniel on writing historical fiction. I think everyone will really enjoy it. So with that, we will sign off and we will see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.